2025年10月16日，当雅虎财经记者朱莉坐在美国经济学家杰伊面前时，她绝对没想到会听到这样一句话：美国第一次站在了被制裁的一方，而且毫无准备。你可能无法想象，一个在华尔街观察多年的经济学家，居然会公开说出这样的话。他用股票市场印证，提到了中国科技股今年涨了 40%， 纳斯达克才涨 20%， 这个被华尔街刻意隐瞒多年的秘密终于被他捅破了。杰伊用最直白的语言告诉记者，中国不需要英伟达芯片了。当华为公开制定3年计划挑战英伟达，当中国的开源 AI 模型包揽全球前5，当美国财政部长贝森特这几天的表态前后矛盾，慌不择路时，他看到的是一个正在发生的历史拐点。中国已经把对美国的依赖从弱点变成了优势。他甚至断言，在接下来的几个季度内，中美会实现和解，而这将引发中国股市的又一轮重大上涨。今天，让我们一起走进这场信息量爆炸的对话，看看这位敢说真话的经济学家如何用最犀利的观察揭示中美科技竞争的真相。
Jay, it's good to see you. Again, we're sort of back to the day by day trying to figure out where the trade winds are blowing. After taking the market sort of off guard last Friday with his comment, things have settled down to some degree. But what's your read of the situation and what it means for investors?
Julie, great to be with you. And I think it's really interesting. The U.S. has really had its own way in terms of sanctioning other countries for several decades. And so we've become more and more used to reaching for that tool or that instrument in our kind of political toolbox when we want to deal with other countries, particularly, countries that we're not pleased with. And so I think what we're dealing with today is something quite different, which is for the first time, really, the U.S. is on the receiving end of being sanctioned and is not really prepared for it and doesn't like it. And so responds, impetuously, as we saw over the last couple of days. And so I think, you go back and track Secretary Besson's comments over the last 4 or 5 days, it's all over the place. And so I think it's not really worth spending a lot of time listening to the administration here. We're going to meet with China. I think it's quite clear that China has made it clear in turn to the U.S. that A, it doesn't need NVIDIA chips. That was a statement made by the Chinese government several weeks ago. And B, the U.S. does need China's rare earth dominance. And so in terms of who has the upper hand here, I think it's China. And so we're operating on the assumption that in the coming quarters, there will be a rapprochement between the U.S. and China that quite possibly could include a signal to U.S. institutions that it's now okay to buy Chinese equities, something that they've been really kind of adverse or unwilling to do since the first Trump administration. And that could set off, in our view, another big leg up in Chinese equities.
I want to dig into that, Jay, but I am curious about one thing that you talked about, which is that you shouldn't put much stock in the sort of back and forth commentary that we've been hearing from the Treasury Secretary. But why put stock in it when China says we don't need NVIDIA chips? I mean, why is that not a little disingenuous as well?
Well, because I think evidence is increasingly clear that China has gotten to a point in the semi space and in the artificial intelligence space where it's a peer of the United States. If you look at open source models, for example, several years ago, of the top 5, 3 or 4 were U.S. Most recently, the top 5, all of them are Chinese. If you look at Huawei's public statements over the last couple of weeks, which is quite unusual for a Chinese tech company to publicly talk about how it's going to move up the ladder of expertise and compete with NVIDIA. They laid out a 3-year plan to do so publicly. And so I think it's not that China has gotten to a point where it's as good as NVIDIA? No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that China is comfortable positioning itself to compete with the U.S. without any U.S. inputs into its tech stack. And something we've called Splinternet. We've been writing about it and talking about it for years, and it's really manifesting where the two countries, U.S. and China, their tech stacks are increasingly being separated as AI becomes kind of a weapon that both sides are reaching for to, in their view, potentially control the global economy and the global security setup.
And so, Jay, do you think that U.S. investors should already be buying Chinese tech stocks in particular?
Oh, yeah. We've talked about it before, Julie. Yeah. China tech has been dominant performance-wise versus the U.S. for several years. This is one of the best-kept secrets on Wall Street. KWEB, the China tech ETF, is up close to 40% year to date versus the Q's up less than 20. They now dominate the China tech space, which is much bigger than the U.S. tech space, growing much faster than the U.S. and trading at a third to a half discount in terms of valuation. So yes, we have been and are and continue to be overweight Chinese equities within our global multi-asset model. We expect to continue to be that way. And as I said, I think the opportunity, the potential is really twofold. First, that there's a rapprochement and Trump signals that it's okay to buy Chinese equities. Second, and perhaps more importantly, is what China is doing to fight deflation in its own country, in its own economy. And we think they will have success in that fight. It's one of the reasons why we're bullish global growth for next year. And in so doing, better inflation means higher corporate earnings, which means greater multiples, higher stock prices, and et cetera, et cetera.
And if there is no rapprochement, does China have the tools that it needs to still fight deflation? You know, if they're not, if the U.S. is not buying, for example, if they're not getting that influx of capital from the U.S.?
No, I mean, the U.S. has become less and less important to China. China got the message in the first Trump term and has been working hard to de-risk itself from the United States. And you can see that in terms of the trade, which you mentioned. The U.S. is now about 15% of Chinese exports. And keep in mind that, you know, exports are only a small part of China's overall growth in terms of the economy as a whole. And so it's less and less important. What China has done has turned a weakness into a strength by shifting those exports from the U.S. to the rest of the world, particularly the global South. And so where Chinese exports are growing most rapidly year over year are Southeast Asia, and therefore they're integrating the Asian economic space, which is a big theme for us in our tripolar world thesis. And then secondly, they're expanding into Africa, which is the second fastest growing recipient of Chinese exports. And a lot of people talk about dumping and this and that. And look, the reality is that people are not being forced to buy Chinese exports. China is increasingly doing and producing things that the rest of the world wants and needs, particularly in the high-end space of renewables. China's dominance in the renewable energy space is now becoming a major factor in allowing them to reduce exposure to the U.S. and become more integral to other countries as they seek to lower their power costs, which in turn is becoming a real competitive advantage. Renewable energy, lower power costs, those are the drivers to national growth, we believe, in the coming years. And it's something, of course, which the U.S. is rowing back aggressively against the rest of the world, which I think is sadly not going to end well in terms of relative competitiveness.
Jay, great to see you. Thanks a lot.
Always a pleasure, Julie.
听完杰一的分析，让我们把视野拉得更宽一点。过去70年，美国建立起来的那套游戏规则正在一点一点失效。 从技术封锁到金融制裁，美国手里的牌看起来还有很多，但每一张都在贬值。当美国还在用制裁这个老武器的时候，他忽略了一个致命问题：中国现在只有 15% 的出口去往美国，而出口本身只占中国经济的一小部分。这意味着美国失去了最关键的那张牌——经济绑架。更可怕的是，当美国在全球挥舞关税大棒时，中国正在用可再生能源和更低的电力成本重新定义竞争力。东南亚、非洲、拉丁美洲，中国出口增长最快的地方，都是这些正在崛起的新兴市场。美国以为自己在惩罚中国，实际上是在逼着全球南方抱团取暖。而美国呢？贝森特这几天的表态为什么前后矛盾？因为他们发现工具箱里已经没有好用的工具了。制裁，中国不怕；技术封锁，华为已经站起来了；金融脱钩，人民币国际化正在加速。美国越是强硬，越是暴露它的虚弱。它已经不再是那个可以一手遮天的超级大国了。美国的衰落是一个长期过程的必然结果。当一个国家把所有精力放在如何打压别人，而不是提升自己时，衰落就已经写进了剧本。基础设施老化了几十年，制造业空心化到连口罩都造不出来，社会撕裂到一场选举都能引发内战般的对立。这些问题不是靠制裁中国就能解决的，而中国在做的是脚踏实地的事情：升级产业链，投资新能源，拓展全球市场，提升科技实力。当美国还在争论要不要禁止中国芯片时，中国的 AI 模型已经在开源领域领先全球了。这就是差距，每一天都在拉大。所以当杰伊说中美会在未来几个季度实现和解时，我相信他看到的不是美国的善意，而是美国的无奈。因为他发现继续对抗下去，受伤的只会是自己，而中国已经做好了准备。无论是继续对抗还是坐下来谈判，他都有足够的底气。历史的车轮滚滚向前，从来不会因为谁的意志而停下。今天的美国就像当年的大英帝国，还在怀念自己的辉煌，却不愿意正视自己的衰落。而那些真正有远见的人，早就已经把目光投向了东方。好啦，这就是本期节目。如果你觉得还不错，可以给我点赞、订阅支持一下。我们下期节目再见。